The Christmas story is filled with colorful, exotic figures whom we meet each year in the Advent and Christmas seasons. Here we should not be surprised to encounter rough shepherds on night duty, choirs of angels singing in the heavens, and even astrologers riding camels. But one of the most intriguing of all is one who greeted the divine child while both of them were still in their mother's womb, spent his days in the desert eating insects and wearing camel skin, though we are not told whether it was from the same camels that carried the Magi. This man, whom we know as John the Baptist, gives powerful witness to the Christ by living as the poorest of beggars, a sort of homeless hippie of the desert. It was of him, this mysterious voice in the wilderness, that Jesus said, "What did you go out into the desert to see? A man wearing fine clothes? Oh no, those who wear fine clothes are to be found in palaces. To see a prophet? Oh yes, he is a prophet, but he is much more than a prophet. He is the greatest person a woman ever bore." And so it is that in all his poverty and raggedness, John the Baptist appears this time each year to lead us to the Christ as no one of palaces and titles and fancy clothes ever could. We find him in the desert. He leads us to the crib, and we discover the way to the center of our very selves. But you have to start in the desert. Now, to get there, you don't have to drive to Egypt or to Mongolia or even to Palm Springs. There is desert enough right where we find ourselves, wherever that may be. Half a century ago, on the evening of November 16th, 1965, a group of 42 Catholic bishops found themselves in the middle of one of the most opulent places in all the world, wearing the finest, most ornate clothes imaginable, addressed with the fanciest titles on the planet, immersed in the unbelievable wealth and splendor of princely palaces and magnificent luxury. They were, of course, in Rome, where the bishops of the world had been meeting for that truly groundbreaking event called by good Pope John the 23rd and known as the Second Vatican Council. Inspired by the holy simplicity of this saintly pope and the one who succeeded him upon his death, inspired by all the sincere soul-searching that had been going on at this remarkable meeting, these bishops looked around them, looked at all their finery, their fancy titles and robes and jewels and gold and mansions and palaces and power, and asked themselves, what on earth are we doing? What does all this have to do with the humility and goodness of the Christ we are supposed to be leading people to? How can we possibly be credible witnesses to his message, living and looking like proud, pompous peacocks? It is time to go back to the desert and find him. And they did. But to get to the desert, those bishops did not look for the next first-class camel to Arabia. They found the desert right where they were. Underneath all the lavish pomp of the great city lies something far more authentic, far more sacred, and far more simple. A holy desert without sand, known as the Catacombs. Here it was, in the miles and miles of underground tunnels, that hundreds of thousands of the earliest Christians were buried. Here it was that in the sacred simplicity of the tombs, the ancient martyrs were honored, Mass was celebrated, and the prayers and hymns of Christ's earliest followers were raised to heaven. Here it was that 2 millennia later, these good bishops sought to recover the sincerity and simplicity of the early church. Good Pope John had emphasized the basic message of Jesus, that the real church of Christ was the church of the poor, and the reforms of the council sought to make visible this reality that had become so obscured in the later centuries. These bishops now descended into the darkness and stillness of the catacombs to commit themselves to this radical vision of Jesus. In a breathtakingly powerful moment, they celebrated Mass together over the tombs of the martyrs. And in the dim light of the ancient tunnel, each of the bishops approached the altar and affixed his signature to a truly visionary manifesto that has become known as the Pact of the Catacombs. These bishops were committing themselves to changing their lives forever. They vowed to stop using expensive limousines and possessions, insignia of gold and jewels, luxurious mansions, sumptuous costumes, and pompous titles, dedicating themselves instead to a life of poverty and advocating for the rights of the poor and powerless, making themselves humanly present and welcoming to all people of all beliefs. It was to be a radical transformation of the face of the church, a return to the desert, a return to the Baptist, a return to the Christ. Subsequently, 500 bishops would sign the Pact of the Catacombs, and they presented it to the Holy Father. These good men took it quite seriously, just as the prophet in the wilderness had been taken seriously. And the face of the church and the world began to change. There was opposition, as always, by the powers that stood to lose so much power. Thus, John the Baptist lost his head. Jesus was crucified. And in our generation, several bishops, many priests, sisters, and lay people, and possibly at least one pope, gave their lives for their adherence to this vision. Not surprisingly, even in some sectors of the church itself, there was powerful opposition. A change of leadership ushered in a 35-year period of quite different priorities. The Pact of the Catacombs and all it stood for became dangerous territory. Isn't the desert of Christ always dangerous territory? It was all but forgotten until the election of a Holy Father with vast experience among the poor and downtrodden, a fresh voice in the wilderness, calling us back to the church of the desert, the church of the catacombs, calling us back to the simplicity and service of the church of Christ. It is this poorer, humbler, freer church, a church without power or pretense or pride, that Pope Francis embraces as the convincing witness needed for the world of today. The vision of good Pope John, the vision of the Christ, the vision of a poor church for the poor, a church of mercy and compassion, has been unmistakably resurrected. The Pact of the Catacombs has begun finally to re-emerge from exile, legitimized, proclaimed, and lived by no less a personage than the Pope in Rome. Living simply and humbly himself, he calls upon all bishops of the world to do the same, to look like, live like, and even smell like their flock, to be close to those most in need, to be inclusive and welcoming towards all. Often I have ventured into barren deserts and listened for the voice of God. Often I have descended into still, dark catacombs to connect with that same awesome presence. The journey to the crib begins in such places, begins in the silent wilderness of the heart, in the sands and tombs of authentic humility and humble authenticity. It is there, and only there, that we can hear that voice crying out in the desert, calling us home to ourselves, calling us home to God.